Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight's story, we got the Death Guard meeting the Yunning Xenos, that being the Tau. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Empire. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get to the video.
Nhexos. Vale lay at the bright edge of Empire, where the mapped dominion of the Tau narrowed to a blade-thin frontier, and the void beyond remained black, unpromised, and full of old hungers. It was not one world alone, but a colonial cluster held together by doctrine, labour, and the patient geometry of expansion. At its heart stood the primary Sept city, a pale and angular hive of layered terraces, command spires, drone gantries, atmospheric veins, and transit rings raised above a basin of ochre stone. Beyond it rose the three agridomes, each one vast enough to house nations beneath its curved skin, each one filled with nutrient seas, grain towers, irrigation engines, livestock pens for sanctioned auxiliaries, and the careful artificial climates by which the Earth caste made life, where no generous life had existed before. Above the world, orbital yards circled in ordered procession, lit by guidance beacons and the cold blue glare of repair docks. Farther out still, the mining moons, turned in their lonely courses, cut into terraces, shafts, and extraction cathedra. Billions lived across the cluster, Tau of every caste, human auxiliaries taken into service and named Guevesa beneath the stern mercy of the greater good. Crude kindreds bound by contract, labour drones in uncounted numbers, cargo servitors, sanitation engines, atmospheric skimmers, ore lifters, survey wings, and patrol craft. All of it balanced upon schedules, quotas, and the promise that one day Nhexos Vale would cease to be a hard frontier, holding and become a true jewel of the eastern fringe. Hope lived there, but it was the hard kind. Not warmth, not softness. It was a hope of labour rosters and ration yields, of wall thickness and missile stockpiles, of the next convoy due from deeper Sept territory, of the next shipment of machine cores, the next cadre rotation, the next census, the next expansion charter. It was the hope of an empire that did not pray for salvation, but manufactured it. Chassel Sachea Kaiserin watched his cadres drill beneath a sky the colour of old brass. The exercise plain below the western defence escarpment had been carved into terraces of ferrocrete and target berms, with pulse-marked barricades, drone pylons, and bunkered command nodes, spaced according to mathematically perfect fields of fire. Fire warriors moved across it in disciplined waves, blue-white muzzle flashes stuttering in exact cadence. Markerlight teams tagged advancing targets. Missile drones rose and fell on grav motors with machine grace. Two crisis teams came down from the clouds in clean arcs of fire, stabilizers venting white steam as they struck the dust and opened up on armoured silhouettes arrayed along the trench line. The silhouettes vanished in incandescent bloom. Kaiserin stood with his helm mag-clamped at his hip, his narrow face unreadable, his gaze fixed not on the brilliance of impact, but on the flaws between heartbeats. A squad too slow to pivot. A drone, wing drifting half a degree off spacing. A breach team hesitating before smoke cover. Again, he said. The order went across the command link and the entire exercise reset. Behind him, Governor Paula Tashel Viorn folded his hands into his sleeves and attempted diplomacy with the stiffness of a civilian addressing a blade. The cadres have already exceeded this cycle's readiness markers, honoured Chassel. The external threat index remains within acceptable parameters. Piratical activity has fallen. Orc pressure in the outer lanes is negligible. Kaiserin did not turn to look at him. Piratical activity teaches greed. Orcs teach noise. neither teaches fear. The governor said nothing to that. Kaiserin continued, his voice clipped with the dry precision of the firecast. You are thinking in terms of nuisance war, raiders, vagrants, sporadic greenskin violence, frontier attrition. Those are tolerable. They are not the measure of readiness. At last, he faced the governor, and the civilian visibly regretted having asked for conversation. We hold an exposed edge, Kaiserin said. Edges are tested, not always by the enemy one expects. The governor inclined his head. Then what do you expect, Chassel? Kaiserin looked back to the plain. The unacceptable. Far below, the drill began once more. Elsewhere in the Sept city, beneath cool light panels and the murmur of concealed air engines, Pauvre Borkan Gel moved through another battlefield entirely. His was built of words, not pulse fire. He passed beneath hanging display screens that showed crop yields, ship arrival projections, habitation density maps, and carefully curated civic affirmations drawn from the teaching archives. He crossed from the polished chambers of district arbitration into the lower negotiation halls where the human delegations preferred to gather and where the scent of them, sweat, oils, recaf, machine grease, and old animal unease clung more stubbornly to the air. Guvesa district chiefs waited within, flanked by aides and record drones. Kroot leaders stood apart, lean and watchful, their avian eyes reflecting the chamber light with cold intelligence. Gel greeted each according to rank and function. He did not rush. To rush was to reveal strain, and strain had no place in governance. The water allotment reductions to the southern Habrings are temporary, he told the human chiefs, his tone smooth as worked glass. The agridomes have drawn additional purification loads. This will be corrected. It has been corrected 3 times already, said one of the Guvesa, a heavy-jawed man with cropped grey hair and a scar tracking from ear to chin. With respect, Pauvre, my people are beginning to think correction is another word for delay. Gel offered a small, practiced smile. That is because your people think in the short rhythm of discomfort. The Tau Empire thinks in the long rhythm of survival. The man bristled, but Gel had already turned, because concession was a tool best applied in measured doses, never in surrender. To the Kroot Shaper he said, your kindred will receive expanded hunting rights in the Ash Barrens east of the Third Dome, provided your warriors remain outside the irrigation belts. There have been complaints. The Shaper clicked his beak. Complaints are prey noises. Your little herd creatures are soft. They are productive, Gel replied. Softness is irrelevant. Productivity is sacred. That, at least, the Shaper understood. Every grievance, Gel believed, could be rendered useful. Hunger could be redirected into labor. Resentment could be harnessed into service. Difference could be structured into hierarchy. The greater good was not kindness. It was architecture. It made walls out of arguments and bridges out of necessity. When the summons came for the civic transmission, Gel excused himself with impeccable grace and rose into the upper spires, where the ethereal cast already waited before arrays of projectors and signal altars. Aunel Tokoshi stood upon the broadcast dais in stillness that did not seem natural. Around him, attendants moved with downcast eyes, making final calibrations. He was slight beside the armored guards who flanked the chamber, but authority condensed around him like gravity. Every light seemed to gather at his shoulders. Across Nhexos Vale, billions paused when he began to speak. In hab clusters, in transit tubes, in drone foundries, in agri halls, in ore shafts, in command bunkers, in mess chambers, on loading decks and defense lines, his image flared to life. Even Kaiserin, still upon the exercise terraces, looked up as the sky itself filled with the ethereal's calm face. "Children of the Empire," Koshi said, and his voice moved through the colony like warm water through pipes of iron. "You labor at the edge of the mapped stars. You endure wind, distance, scarcity, and toil, and by that endurance you prove the truth that lesser species cannot grasp. Order is stronger than chance, unity is stronger than fear, purpose is stronger than suffering." He did not raise his voice, yet every syllable seemed to settle into the bones of those who heard it. Nhexos Vale is not an outpost to be forgotten. It is not a mere holding. It is the bright threshold of a greater age. When the next expansion convoys arrive, when our fleets deepen these routes and our cities rise in number, this colony cluster shall stand as a model frontier sept. Here the greater good shall show its face to the void, and the void shall learn obedience. The transmission ended in ritual stillness. Across the world and its orbitals, labor resumed, voices lowered. Panic, if any had stirred, retreated into private chambers. For a few measured moments, it seemed enough. Then Fiowi Dalith Tor requested immediate audience. He arrived at the command level with no trace of ceremonial discipline. His robe was stained with lubricant and sealant dust. Servo skulls and diagnostic drones buzzed behind him, trailing data slates and corrosion samples in sealed ampules. He bowed, but only just enough to satisfy protocol before placing the first slate into Kaiseren's hand. "Void dock seals on berth 17 through 23, Tor said. "Microfracture bloom accompanied by chemical degradation. The compounds do not match known industrial wear." Kaiseren flicked through the projection. "Sabotage? Possibly. Unlikely. Atmospheric samplers in the northern intake towers are also returning dead zones. No contaminants detected because the machines cease function at the point of contact. There is more." Tor keyed another image. Interior housings, sterile engine chambers, cooling units. The feed magnified pale stringing masses clotted in the corners of machine interiors. "Organic growth," Tor said. "Inside sealed systems. That should be impossible." Gel, who had entered at the summons, studied the image with a diplomat's dislike of anything that did not answer to persuasion. "Can it be burned out?" Tor looked at him as one might look at a laborer offering theology to a machine. "Of course it can be burned out. That is not the issue. The issue is how it was born there." Kaiseren gave the slate back. "Contain the affected systems, isolate personnel, sweep for saboteurs." He meant to say more, but the chamber darkened by a shade as one of the tactical displays shifted from civic mode to void alert. An outer mining station had ceased transmission. No distress call, no reactor scream, no report of collision or attack. One moment it had been there, a glittering node amidst the moons, with its drones moving along ore gantries and cargo crawlers. The next, its telemetry froze mid-task. A lifter drone remained hanging above an open shaft. Ore belts stopped with cargo half-loaded. Auspec's pings returned only the station's mass and the cold revolving of its shell. Kaiseren's jaw tightened. "Scout flotilla. Immediate deployment. I want live feed from breach teams." The vessels went at once, cutting across the black in disciplined formation. All through their approach, the station remained dark, turning like a blind eye. The first feed came back in stuttering bursts from helmet lenses and drone optics. Airlocks answered manual override with sluggish reluctance. Interior passageways stood sealed, not broken, sealed. Bulkheads had been closed in sequence as if by a hand more patient than panic. There were no burn marks, no breach scars, no sign of boarding violence, only silence. Then the teams forced entry deeper in. One fire warrior recoiled and the feed juddered violently before steady discipline asserted itself. The corridor ahead was carpeted in slick, blackened fluid. Bodies lay where station workers had collapsed, their limbs twisted, their eyes burst with pressure, their mouths opened wide around tongues swollen blue-black. Some had clawed at their own throats until their nails tore free. Others were fused to deck plating beneath mats of wet fungal growth that crawled over boots, gloves, and exposed flesh alike. "By the code," someone whispered. Kaiseren's voice cut across the link like a blade. "Report." The team leader swallowed audibly before speaking. "No visible combat, Chassel." Repeating, "No visible combat. Casualties total in this section. Lungs appear ruptured. Extensive internal hemorrhage. Unknown biological spread present. Advancing to Med Bay." They found one survivor there. He had been strapped into a diagnostic cradle, perhaps by med drones, perhaps by comrades already dead. His chest fluttered in failing spasms. Black bile soaked his chin. Strings of bloody mucus hung from his lips like threads of dark glass. One of the breach team leaned close to hear him through the gurgle in his throat. The man's eyes rolled toward the lens. Not Tau. Human. Gervasa, labor overseer by the look of him, though almost nothing remained in his face now that disease had swollen it into something ruinous and strange. His voice came wet and ruined over the link. "They came slow," he croaked. "They did not need haste." Then he convulsed so violently that blood sprayed the med frame in a fan of dark red, and the feed became a wash of warning runes. Kaiseren did not move for several heartbeats. Then he gave orders with absolute clarity. "Full containment. No ship approaches the station without my sanction. Breach teams are sealed and quarantined. All data is restricted to command level. No public release. No worker channels. No district broadcasts. Shut every mouth that is not required to speak." Gel turned to him at once. "That will not hold." "It will hold long enough." "For whom?" Gel asked. "For the command cast, perhaps. Not for the billions in the hives and agri-habitats. Rumor is faster than doctrine. Silence will not calm them, Kaiseren. Silence will feed panic." Kaiseren faced him, and for a moment the chamber held the cold tension of incompatible truths. "I am not protecting calm," the Shazzle said. "I am protecting readiness." "And I," Gel replied, quieter but no less hard, "am telling you that a population kept ignorant at the edge of fear becomes harder to govern than any visible enemy." Before Kaiseren could answer, the outer auger net began to sing. The tone was low at first, beneath hearing more than sound, a tremor that entered through deck plating and the bones of those standing above it. Then the tactical hololith changed. Beyond the frontier lanes, beyond the mapped traffic routes and beacon chains, shapes emerged from the dark. Ancient hulls, massive, diseased in outline. Their signatures were wrong in a way that made lesser categories meaningless. Not merchant, not pirate, not any clean military pattern held in the archives of Nhexos Vale. They did not come in attack formation. They glided in a slow and terrible procession, as if speed had become beneath them, as if they crossed the void with the certainty of things that had already taken the system in some older, fouler accounting, and now returned merely to collect it. No signal ran before them, no demand, no haste. On the hololith, the ships moved like drifting corpses over a grave they already owned. The first returns from the outer auger net were so contradictory that 3 separate machine casts accused one another of calibration failure before the truth settled in with the cold weight of a blade laid against the throat. The intruders could be tracked. They could be measured. They could not be made to make sense. Their tonnage shifted between readings as if the vessels carried false masses within them or bled unseen substances into the void. Their heat bloom was neither the disciplined signature of military drives nor the ragged flare of civilian engines pushed beyond tolerance, but something sickened and wet in the data, a fever pattern more akin to a body in collapse than a fleet under power. Their hull profiles seemed to rot between scans. One pass showed clean lines beneath corrosion. The next showed plates buckled outward like scabbed flesh, cathedral spines bent under fungal bloom, and rents along the flanks from which no atmosphere escaped, because the ships did not appear to require such sanity. At Central Command, Fioi Dalith Tor enlarged one of the drifting spectrographs until the chamber walls swam green with decayed readings. He moved his long fingers through the projection, separating layers of false return, thermal bleed, particulate wake, and corruptive static. None of it clarified the whole. "They remain under thrust," he said at last. "The output confirms directed movement, yet no functional vessel should present such levels of material degradation and remain battle-capable. I would classify the readings as impossible." Shassel Satsea Kaiserin stood with his hands behind his back, helm sealed now, red eye lenses fixed upon the diseased silhouettes. "Nothing that arrives from the dark at our edge is impossible, only unwanted." Around the hololithic basin, the casts of Nhexos Vale assembled in strained formality. Firecast officers in armor and command robes stood in hard lines, their impatience masked only by discipline. Earthcast analysts crowded the side stations with tablets, corrosion samples, and diagnostic swarms. Watercast functionaries carried themselves with studied calm, though even Pauvre Borkengel's polished ease had worn thin at the edges. Above them all, upon the raised command crescent, Aunel Taukoshi watched the shifting fleet with a serenity that was either perfect control or a refusal to grant the moment its due weight. The debate began as such debates always began when the edge of empire trembled. "We strike first," said Chassevre Dalith Renan, commander of the orbital hunter cadres. His gauntleted hand cut through the projection. Fast void intercept, rail batteries from the ring, manta spearheads from the upper yards. We gut their lead vessels before they close another measure. Tor made a small sound of irritation. "You do not gut what you have not understood. I understand mass and trajectory. You understand impact. I require composition, atmospheric tolerances, structural resiliency, pathogen risk, material corruption vectors. What you require," Renan said, "is time. If you ask the void for more of it, it rarely grants the request." Pauvre Gel inclined his head slightly before stepping between the argument, as a man might step between blades and believe his voice armor enough. "We know neither motive nor command disposition. An unannounced arrival does not yet confirm hostile intent. At the frontier, fear too readily becomes miscalculation. A formal hail should be attempted." One of the Firecast officers gave a low, disapproving breath through his helm grill. "Their first contact with us was a dead station. And ignorance breeds worse decisions than caution," Gel replied. Kaiserin looked up to the ethereal. "Arnel." Koshi's gaze did not leave the fleet. "The Empire is not a beast that snaps at every shadow. Ordered contact shall be offered. If there is reason within them, it will be given a path. If there is only barbarity, then we shall know that also." The command chamber stilled. No one openly contested an ethereal. Kaiserin bowed his head once. "Then the path is opened." The transmission was assembled with careful symbolism. Tau command cant first, then trade lexicons, then translated strands of human Low Gothic for the benefit of unknown auxiliaries or corrupted settlers who might infest the approaching fleet. The message was disciplined, direct, and merciful in its wording. You approach the holdings of Nhexos Vale, servant cluster of the Tau Empire. Identify command authority, state need, accept ordered compliance beneath the greater good, and be received according to function. It went out across the dark. For a long time, nothing answered. Static thickened the response channels with a hiss like breath through rotted lungs. Signal adepts adjusted frequency and gain. Auto-spirits in the human-derived translation banks began to mutter warning tones at levels the Tau systems themselves did not recognize. One by one, non-essential lumens in the chamber dimmed, not from power failure, but from fluctuation. Tor swore under his breath and slapped a drone aside when it tried to interpret the anomaly as ambient drift. Then the signal came. It did not so much arrive as infest the chamber. The reply crawled through the speakers in cracked, dragging Gothic, the consonants heavy, with old cruelty and lungs half drowned in fluid. This veil is measured. This veil is ripe. Rejoice. We have come to make it eternal. No one spoke for several heartbeats. Then the image burst across the translation plate, not as a clean heraldic declaration, but as a flickering ruin of color and shape. A green field devoured by rust. A fly sigil black against rot. White armor stained to the hue of old corpse fat. Sensors. Chains. A cracked plate of ceramite bearing the numeral of an age before the Tau had crawled from their caves. The machine could not resolve the whole, but it resolved enough. Poor Vregel found his voice first, because silence, in his office, was a surrender. Cult theatre, he said. Deliberate obscurantism, a primitive fear display. They wish to appear older and stranger than they are. Across the chamber, a human auxiliary veteran made a sound that was almost a cough and almost a prayer strangled in its birth. Guevesavo Doran Hale stepped, closer to the projection, with his face gone grey beneath its weathered bronze. No, he said. Gel turned toward him with restrained annoyance. Explain. Hale did not take his eyes from the image. I know that mark. Not from service records. From forbidden archives. Imperial ones. Old histories. Things we were told to forget because they belong to a dead superstition. His jaw worked once. Death Guard. The word hung in the chamber like a stain. Several of the younger Tau glanced to one another, not in fear, but in calculation. The term held no instinctive power for them. Not yet. Kaiserin saw Hale's expression and trusted that far more than any archive. What are they? The Chassel asked. Hale answered without looking away. Space Marines, traitor lineage, ancient, plague bearers, siege killers, system poisoners. He swallowed. Imperial histories described them as impossible to stop once they made planetfall. Those histories tended toward exaggeration. Even so, I would rather it had been orcs. Kaiserin turned back to the projection. Then we will educate ourselves quickly. The enemy fleet continued its advance with the infuriating absence of haste. No sharp acceleration. No void lance opening fire across the lanes. No grand hammer blow against the ring. Instead, the ancient ship spread with funereal patience, taking positions that only slowly revealed their purpose. Small objects began to leave them in uncounted numbers. Not attack craft, not torpedoes. The contacts drifted, spun, and dispersed. Tor was the first to understand enough to become pale. They are seeding the system. The objects entered the orbital lanes. not in concentrated military salvos, but in broad patterns of contamination. Shells with fragile casings that burst into clouds of particulate rot. Corpse pods packed with fluids slopped dead that split against hull plating and station skins, smearing meat and pathogens across surfaces and intake ports. Metal canisters that drifted into recycler streams, docking vents, coolant uptake mouths, and upper atmosphere processors before opening like obscene flowers. A relay officer raised his voice. Upper filtration towers in the Northern Hemisphere are reporting contamination alerts. Another answered from a lower pit. Orbital Yard 3 has sealed 2 water reclamation trunks. Then a third. Medicae stockpiles aboard platform Borkan Dawn show compound instability, nutrient gels spoiling in containment. Tor slammed both palms against the tactical rail so hard that the drones around him jittered backward. Not the guns, he snapped. The organs. They are attacking the organs first. He sent projection overlays flooding through the chamber. Water maps, filtration systems, atmospheric processors, reclaimer pipes, medical reserves, food purity chains, drone sanitation routes, the intricate internal body of a functioning Tau colony cluster lit in clean blue lines. They are targeting hygiene, filtration, recycling, medicine, and food purity, Tor said. Not as secondary nuisance, as primary assault. His voice sharpened with revulsion. They are conducting war by infection vector. They intend the colony itself to become the weapon. Kaisren's decision came without hesitation. Seal upper current intakes, burn the recycler lines in all affected sectors, sterilize water chains from orbit if required, divert civilian stocks to protected reserve. Gel rounded on him. If you sterilize by orbital fire, you will terrify the population beyond recovery. If I do not, Tor said before Kaisren could answer, their children will drink this. The first boarding alarm interrupted them. Platform Sasia Vigilance reported hull breach across its outer maintenance spine. Then platform Gelresh. Then the defense bastion holding the western macro rail. Impacts rippled across the ring in ugly sequence. Not elegant insertion, not disciplined marine assault. Crude, battering violence delivered by impact pods and boarding cysts that ruptured across station skins in floods of slime, spore cloud, and screaming flesh. The interior channels filled with gunfire, alarms, and voices torn apart by panic. Crute auxiliaries on Deck 17 are in contact. Unknown hostiles do not cease advance under pulse saturation. Bulkhead line is failing. Repeat, failing. Something small is inside the ventilation trunks. Fire suppression is spreading contamination. Emperor, preserve. The last voice died in a wet, tearing shriek. Kaiseren was already moving. Battlesuit cadres to me. Close intercept pattern. We clear the ring by hand. No one argued, not even Gel. The launch bay of Command Bastion Tashivar burned with red warning runes and the shriek of emergency klaxons. Crisis suits dropped from magnetic cradles while armor crews sealed plates and fed fresh power cells into hungry housings. Kaisren climbed into his battlesuit with the practiced communion of long service. The cockpit sealed around him. Systems woke in layered harmony. Targeting spirits aligned. External vision opened onto chaos. He launched into the void with 6 suits at his back. The defense ring had become a battlefield of spreading wounds. One platform vented atmosphere in glittering sheets. Another spun slowly off true, with its docking arms hanging broken. Fire from point defense nests stitched the dark, catching drifting spores in momentary halos of green light before the spores spread anyway. Too many, too light, too damned. Kaisren came in hard against Sarsia Vigilance, mag-locked to the ruptured station skin, then burned through the breach into interior dark. The smell hit even through the suit filters. Rot, wet copper, excrement. Disinfectant turned sour. Beneath it all, a sweetness so thick it seemed alive. The corridor ahead had become a slaughter trench. Fire warriors lay where they had tried to make a line and been rolled over by weight that did not care for casualties. Human cultists in void-torn rags clawed and shrieked, their flesh pox-ridden, eyes yellow, mouths full of broken prayers. Smaller things skittered through the corpses, horned and chittering, not machine and not beast, but warp filth given scratching form. Pulse rounds blew them apart in sprays of foul vapor. Still they came. Then the real enemy entered sight. They filled the corridor as if they had always owned its dimensions. Huge, slow, certain. Their armor had once been the plate of angels and had become something swollen and obscene, old white drowned beneath corpse-green corrosion and the crust of 1,000 infections. Ceramite bulged around bellies distended with gases that should have burst any living body. Exposed organs swung in rusted cages. Tubes wept slime. Fly clouds haloed their helms. Green mist breathed from their vents. Kaisren put a full burst of plasma into the lead warrior's chest. It should have killed any creature that still belonged to matter. Instead, the giant stumbled, looked down at the molten crater in his armor, and raised his head with the patient displeasure of an elder interrupted during instruction. "Engage!" Kaisren voxed, and the corridor became light and recoil. Missile pods shrieked. Fusion blasters roared white. Burst cannons flensed cult flesh from bone. Fire warriors rallied behind the arriving suits and poured pulse fire in disciplined volleys. Lesser foes tore apart under it. The armored giants did not cleanly. Limbs came off. Bellies burst. Chunks of plate and rotten meat flew from them. They advanced regardless, boots crushing their own dead, as if dead held no distinction from ground. One of them reached a wounded fire warrior who had lost both legs below the knee and was still trying to bring his pulse rifle to bear with hands trembling from shock. The giant's helm was split on one side. Half his face was gone. Teeth showed through flayed cheek. One eye dangled blind in its socket. His remaining eye regarded the Tau with a depthless, exhausted pity. "Do not struggle, little one," he said, his voice a grave full of rain. "Rot is only another form of belonging." Then he brought the butt of his bolter down and crushed the fire warrior's skull into the deck. Kaiseren hit him with another plasma burst at point-blank range, followed by a missile salvo that blew away the giant's shoulder and much of the wall behind him. The warrior toppled to one knee. Black-green fluid sluiced from the wound. He laughed softly, as if amused by diligence, and tried to rise again. Only the concentrated fire of 3 suits finally tore him apart. Platform by platform, corridor by corridor, the counterboarding actions bled on. Kaiseren learned quickly. Decapitation was preferable. Joint destruction mattered. Fire lanes had to remain, open because the enemy sought not only killing ground, but contagion ground. Corpses could not be trusted. Air could not be trusted. Water could not be trusted. Surfaces had to be burned after being won, and sometimes burned while being won. Tactically, the ring held. 3 boarding attempts were cut apart before reaching reactor sanctums. 2 corrupted water nodes were jettisoned into the void before their lines infected the rest of the chain. A macro-rail bastion destroyed one of the drifting plague cruisers outright, with a broadside that split its diseased belly from spine to keel. Tau cadres fought with precision, and where precision could still impose itself upon matter, They were deadly. Strategically, the ring was already losing. From every station window, from every external pict feed, the same horror unfolded across the world below. Canisters burst in the upper atmosphere and trailed thin veils of coloured rot into the jet streams. High over the agridomes, cloud systems thickened into bruised streaks. Reclamation towers reported contamination. Rain catchments went foul. Upper air became a carrier. What did not die in vacuum descended toward the surface, wrapped in currents and weather. By the time Kaiserren returned to Central Command, his suit was spattered with things the decon crews burned away before they dared let him cross the inner threshold. He entered the chamber to find every display transformed, no longer merely fleet vectors and station damage. Now the planet itself had become the chart of the war. Red contamination plumes, yellow quarantine sectors, blacked out intake regions, medical purity failures, crop spoilage probabilities, water chain corruption forecasts. Pauvre Gel stood silent for once, staring at the world map as if words had finally abandoned him. Tor did not look up from his data altar when he spoke. The defense ring has won several engagements. The orbital lanes remain contested, not broken, but the upper currents are compromised. Kaiserren followed his gaze to the display of Nhexos Vale below. The clouds over the colony cluster were changing colour. He understood then, with a clarity colder than fear. The enemy had not needed to own the ring at once. They had only needed to breathe upon the world. Above the bright edge of Empire, the skies of Nhexos Vale had begun to sicken. Martial law came to Nhexos Vale in the language of sealed doors. Not in speeches first, not in declarations, not in the serene cadences of the ethereal caste trying to make disaster sound like discipline. It came in the clang of blast shutters dropping over transit arteries, in the hard white glare of quarantine runes igniting over hab spires, in the sudden silence of elevator shafts locked between levels, in the hiss of air being cut from one district to preserve another, in the heavy, final thunder of macro bulkheads closing across the throats of whole arcologies, while millions still remained inside them. Across the primary sept city, the ventilation towers began to bleed. At first, it was only discoloration in the upper filters, a green-brown staining that the maintenance drones reported as particulate overload. Then came the wet growths in the intake throats, slick and fibrous, pulsing faintly, as if some crude life had taken root in the steel lungs of the city. Agri-spines that had fed pure nutrient slurry into the dome belts, jammed with clotted filth and strings of fungus, thick as a worker's wrist. Water mains ran cloudy, purifiers sputtered and died. Refugee shelters erected to receive evacuees from the infected orbital stations became fever pits within hours, then charnel rooms when the first dead began to swell. The city maps in Central Command changed by the minute. Blue became amber, amber became red, red became black. Chassel Satsea Kaiserren watched entire habstacks vanish from the operational display beneath the black sigil of sealed loss. There was no outward sign of grief in him. Firecast training made a virtue of emotional economy, and the demands of command had beaten even that economy down to bare utility. Yet every blacked-out sector remained in his sight a measure of failure, not moral failure. The galaxy did not honor morality. Tactical failure, failure to anticipate the full cunning of an enemy that fought by breath, by stain, by panic, by the corruption of systems that civilized minds forgot were mortal because they had always functioned. "Seal the lower rings," he said. The command drones echoed the order. "Chassel," one of the civilian coordinators began, voice tight with disbelief. The lower rings hold more than 3 million inhabitants. Kaisren did not look at him. Then more than 3 million inhabitants will remain below the seal. He turned to the next display. Deploy incineration teams to intake tower districts 7 through 12. No recovery operations. Nothing living exits without triage at weapons point. The civilian did not speak again. Elsewhere in the command spire, Porvre Borkangel and Aunel Taukoshi addressed the colony with faces carefully composed into calm that neither of them truly felt. The broadcasts rolled without pause over every public screen, every hab channel, every labor station, every surviving transit node. The ethereal stood beneath the symbol of the Empire and spoke of resilience. "The crisis is severe," he said, and his voice moved through the city with the practiced assurance of command that expected obedience because it had always been obeyed. "Yet it remains containable. You will remain at your assigned stations. You will submit to all movement restrictions. You will report symptoms without hesitation and accept quarantine without protest. Disorder aids the enemy. Sacrifice strengthens the whole. Every hardship you endure in this hour is endured for the greater good." Then Gel stepped forward and made the same blade sound like silk. "Ration irregularities are temporary. Water restrictions are temporary. Transport interruptions are temporary. You are not abandoned. Relief is being organized. The colony core remains secure. The defense ring remains operational. Our cadres remain in control." It was good work, and part of Gel knew it, even while another part understood that words were becoming thinner by the hour. Too much had already been seen. Too many workers had watched Medici crews drag screaming kin into sealed trams. Too many labor districts had woken to find neighboring towers gone dark behind fresh ferrocrete barriers. Too many bodies had been shrouded in sanitizing foam and burned where they fell. The broadcasts bought time. They could not buy truth. Kaisren used that time with ruthless efficiency. He did not announce that certain districts were already considered lost. He simply diverted cadres away from them. Quietly. Neatly. Fire teams vanished from human majority, habrings, and reappeared along the inner defense belts. Drone reserves intended for refugee escort were reassigned to corridor denial and atmospheric sterilization. Transit permissions were revised. Lift access was denied. Whole towers were left to the mercy of their own air. No proclamation named it culling. The reality required no proclamation. Guevesavo Doran Hale saw the change before most. He had the misfortune of being trusted by both sides and therefore hated by both in equal measure. In the auxiliary districts ringing the southern Manufactorum quarter, he became the face that men turned to when they wanted answers and no longer believed the smooth mouths on the screens. He moved through those districts in a sealed half-mask with a rifle in his hands and too few soldiers at his back. Human auxiliaries, Tau fire teams, municipal labor drones, and Kroot mercenaries made up the ragged line he held together by rank, threat, and raw necessity. The smell of the quarter changed, hour by hour. First disinfectant, then vomit, then the sweet reek of opened bodies. A child died in a stairwell and rose again before his father stopped screaming. A water riot on level 14 became a massacre when the first infected collapsed in the queue, split along the gut, and spilled rot into the crowd. Neighbors who had shared walls for a decade turned on each other over sealed Medicaid doors. Men beat one another to death for purifier tablets. Kroot hired as perimeter hunters dragged plague-swollen bodies into the light and hacked them apart with workmanlike indifference, while human families watched and learned what frontier coexistence was worth when fear stripped the paint from it. Hail waded through it all with a vox in one ear and blood on one sleeve. "Fall back to the inner square," he barked at a mixed squad of auxiliaries as a corpse in a worker's jacket lurched out of a ration line with half its face dissolved. "Do not waste shots on the chest. Head and joints. Head and joints. Curse you." Pulsefire snapped. Autoguns boomed. The corpse fell, twitched, and tried to crawl. A Kroot with a hooked blade came from the flank and removed its head in one savage sweep. One of the younger auxiliaries, barely beard grown, was shaking so hard he could not reload. Hale seized him by the collar. "Look at me," the youth did. "If you panic now, you die now. If you stand, you may die later. Later is a victory. Reload." The youth reloaded. From the towers above came the dull hammering of fists against quarantine doors. The Death Guard did not force a frontal descent upon the main colony at once. That would have been cleaner. It would also have been less cruel, and cruelty seemed to them not an indulgence but a method. They let panic do the opening work. They let contamination travel ahead of bolter and blade. They let logistics choke on themselves. They let the healthy fear the sick, and the sick beg at sealed gates. They let supply, chains knot and snap. They let commanders spend their energy closing breaches that did not look like breaches until they had already flowered into catastrophe. It was a campaign of patience, a siege conducted within flesh, machinery, and public order all at once. Fio Dalith Tor discovered just how deep the rot had entered when the drone failures ceased appearing random and began speaking to one another in corruption. He stood in a sanctified machine vault beneath the eastern agri-spines, while a dozen Earth-cast adepts flensed open a dead sanitation drone on a mag slab before him. Its casing had been washed 3 times in sterilizing acid. Still, the stink remained. Fine capillaries of pale growth had threaded themselves through the drone's logic housing and down into the motive bundles. What should have been inert code wafers were furred with organic residue. The thing had not merely been fouled, it had been made fertile. Tor leaned closer despite the warnings pulsing, across his visor. Data from other sectors streamed around him, nutrient vats breeding black scum that dissolved purity seals from within. Recycling slurries birthing worms too small for standard filters. Medici auto units administering corrupted compounds, as if their treatment libraries had been taught a new and obscene pharmacology. Drone code repositories duplicating fragments of machine instruction that no longer functioned as logic, but as infection vectors. "Report," Kaiseren demanded over the secure channel. Tor's reply came with the flat edge of a mind forced past disgust into precision. "The enemy has infiltrated machine spirits, drone code libraries, nutrient reservoirs, and recycling systems with organic corruption. Not contamination alone, transformation. Our clean lines now gestate filth. Even our maintenance cycles assist it. Can it be cut out? In isolated systems, perhaps, at cluster scale, not without destroying the systems themselves. Then, destroy them." Tor closed his eyes for one breath, not in dissent, but in grief for the engineering. Understood. Kaiseren answered the rot with doctrine. For a short span of hours, it seemed doctrine might be enough. He drew the enemy into layered kill zones through the transit canyons and manufacturum arteries leading toward the colony core. Mobile reserves waited behind false collapses and drone screens. Marker-light webs painted plague armor from hidden galleries. Withdrawal corridors were mapped to the meter and trapped with demolition charges, intended to thin the enemy at each step and deny them mass. Seeker missile ambushes nested in service towers. Hammerhead strike columns prowled the wide industrial causeways, where clean lines of fire still existed, crisis teams dropped from clouded sky lanes in precise arcs, landing with the merciless beauty of perfect timing and opening fire before the enemy could fully react. For a few fierce hours, Tau, war craftsmanship shone with all the hard brilliance of the Empire. The first plague engine to nose into the Western Causeway died under a rail shot so exact that it split from prow to reactor in a line of blue-white ruin. 2 squads of fire warriors held the Northern Vent District against 3 times their number of pox-ridden cultists, discipline turning the corridor mouths into abattoirs where every step forward cost the foe a mound of twitching dead. Kaiseran himself led a descending battlesuit strike onto an enemy spearhead advancing through a collapsed transit interchange, his plasma fire carving great molten wounds through diseased armor, while drone swarms stitched the lesser things apart in fountains of filth. Hammerheads gutted blight haulers at range, missile teams laced alley mouths with precision death. Kroot hunters leapt from smoke and gantries to tear down isolated stragglers before vanishing again into cover. Human auxiliaries, seeing the enemy burn and fall in heaps, found a savage second courage and shouted the names of districts they meant to hold. Even Hale felt it, that old battlefield exaltation, that brutal, dangerous hope born when training, timing, and superior firepower combined so perfectly that for an instant, war looked solvable. He saw a bloated plague crawler burst under concentrated rail fire and cheered with the rest. He watched a crisis team descend like wrath-made metal and cut an entire infection wave in half before its carriers reached the quarantine fence. He heard human voices around him cry that the line was holding. Then the enemy rose inside its own dead. A plague marine whose torso had been cored through by plasma lurched back to his feet, his cavity steaming, his remaining arm bringing up his bolter, as if pain was something remembered dimly from another species' life. Cultists who had been shot down in piles began to convulse, their bellies bloated, their limbs snapped straight. Some tore open entirely and birthed crawling things from within themselves, while others simply heaved upright again, their eyes now milk-thick and empty. Smoke from burning corpses thickened into spore clouds so dense that targeting optics fuzzed and coughed static. Victory, which had seemed so crisp beneath the mathematics of the opening response, went wet and uncertain. Tau doctrine bled for every meter it took, and the enemy did not care. A hammerhead column drove through the eastern grain exchange and annihilated 2 plague engines at range, only for the wrecks themselves to rupture into clouds of corrosive vapor that ate through intake screens and killed 3 tank crews in their own sealed hulls. A fire warrior team won a stairwell with textbook precision and then drowned when recycling mains above them burst with black slurry seeded hours before. Drone wings executed perfect saturation patterns until their own targeting libraries glitched and filled local channels with strings of machine cants so corrupted that guidance systems mistook friend for vector and wall for open air. Kaiseran saw it happening in fragments across 1,000 feeds. Each local success curdled, each clean engagement spoiled. The enemy accepted punishment, absorbed it, and continued with the patient certainty of infection spreading through blood already drawn. At the height of that unraveling, Anil Tokoshi summoned Porvragel to a private chamber behind the public command crescent. The room was small by the standards of power, lit softly, stripped of ceremony. Beyond one screened wall, the civic broadcast continued in Koshi's own voice, repeating assurances to the colony while the living man stood silent before a planetary map marked with plague spread. Gel entered, bowed, and waited. Koshi did not speak at once. When he did, his tone was stripped of all public warmth. If triage becomes necessary, the colony core must be preserved. Gel said nothing. The agridomes, nearest the central population mass, are to receive priority. Inner caste habitation zones are to receive priority. Command, filtration, and military production assets are to receive priority. Gel's throat tightened. And the outer rings? Koshi looked at the map rather than at him. Auxiliary districts on the periphery are to be considered contingent. The diplomat held himself very still. By auxiliary districts, Honored Aunel, do you mean the human belts? I mean those populations whose sacrifice most preserves the whole. Gel had spent years translating necessity into something more graceful. In that room he heard necessity stripped bare. There are billions in those belts, he said quietly. Yes. If we withdraw support from them now, word will spread faster than contagion. Koshi turned then, and the force in his eyes made the room seem smaller. Word is already spreading. Panic is already spreading. Loss is already spreading. You are not being asked to save all. You are being asked to preserve what can continue. Gel lowered his gaze because anything else would have been defiance. As you command. Outside the chamber, the service corridor remained empty, save for a single Gavesa liaison officer who had been waiting to deliver district casualty reports. Doran Hale had heard enough. Not every word. Enough. Enough to understand that the outer human districts were already being entered into the ledgers of command as useful dead. Enough to understand that all the broadcasts of unity and shared burden had a boundary, and that boundary was drawn where human habitations thickened beyond the clean heart of the colony. He stood in the corridor with the report slate heavy in his hands and felt something within him go cold. Not surprise. He had lived too long between empires for surprise. Recognition. Below, far below, in the quarantine belts, men he had trained with were still firing, from stairwells and barricades. Families were still hammering on sealed doors. Children were still drinking rationed water from lines already marked for failure. Croup mercenaries were still collecting payment in flesh and danger. Tau cadres were still dying in the outworks to hold what they had been told mattered. And here, in the quiet chambers of command, the arithmetic had already been completed. To preserve the colony core, the fringes would be fed to rot. Hale looked down at the slate in his hands, at the district names scrolling there in orderly script, and knew with a clarity more cutting than terror that billions had not merely been imperiled. They had been judged acceptable. The second phase began with bells, not alarms. Those still wailed in disciplined tones from command towers and defense bastions, thin and urgent and almost respectable beneath the greater noise of war. What rolled across Nhexos Vale from the descending plague fleet was older and fouler than any system warning. Great iron tolls sounded from the cloud shelf, from the upper atmosphere, from landers dropping through jaundiced weather, from the open maws of diseased engines lowering themselves onto the world as if the sky were a wound and they were fingers probing it. The bells were slow, patient, funereal. Each peal seemed to arrive not only through the air, but through ferrocrete, through bone, through the liquid in the lungs. Men heard them and spat blood. Drones heard them and glitched in their guidance loops. The sick heard them and began to weep or laugh or hammer their foreheads against the nearest wall until skin tore. Above the colony cluster, the heavens had turned the colour of old phlegm. Yellow-green cloud banks rolled low and gravid over the primary sept city and its agricultural belts. shot through with darker streaks where chem bombardment trails cut the sky into seeping scars. The orbital defense rings still burned in places, hurling rail fire and missile, contrails at the ships overhead, but it no longer held the initiative. It held only stubbornness. Through the rents and poison veils came mass planetfall. Drop cysts slammed into the outskirts in hideous succession, splitting open on impact with fleshy detonations that sprayed spores, corpse slurry, and shrieking cultists across defense berms. Heavy landers with blistered hulls descended on columns of green fire. Blight haulers rolled from their bays like armored boils on tracks, their prows slathering infectious vapor. Mortar batteries lobbed bloated shells in long arcs that hung obscenely in the sky before bursting into black rain. Drone flies rose in swarms, their wings a maddening static, their needle mouths searching for eye, wound, or seam. Kaiseren watched the first true continental assault unfold from the command pit of a moving manta, and understood that the enemy had ceased merely poisoning the body of the colony. Now it was driving knives into the organs. The three agridomes had stood for years as monuments to Earth-cast mastery. Great transparent crowns over engineered ecosystems, each one a cathedral of yield and schedule. Under those curving shells, nutrient seas had gleamed in ordered terraces, and grain towers had risen from misted plains. The first rupture took Dome 2 at its western shoulder, where a cluster of plague shells struck the outer lattice in perfect sequence. The shell did not shatter outward so much as sag, split, and peel apart under a pressure of corruption from within. The transparent skin went milk white with fungal bloom and then burst. A wall of diseased biomass came out of it. Rotting nutrient slurry, half-processed grain mash, swollen algal cultures, and millions of litres of feedstock vomited into the open air, with enough force to sweep maintenance habs from their foundations. Workers, loaders, harvest servitors, and panicked refugees were carried with it, tumbling in a torrent of yellow-black filth that spread across the fields in a widening stain. Some drowned. Some crawled from the sludge already blind with infection. Some rose later with mouths full of buzzing flies. When Dome 1 ruptured, the atmosphere beneath its shell met the corrupted weather outside and birthed a fog so thick it rolled like something alive over the crop terraces. Figures moved in it, collapsed, rose again. Fire lines went down sector by sector. What had been an agricultural belt by dawn had become a trench world by dusk. Irrigation channels turned into open ditches of black water and meat. Harvest ridges became firing berms. Food silos burned with greasy light. The ground itself softened under spore rain and the tread of engines until it ceased being soil and became a paste of mud, grain, blood, and excrement. Kaiseren did what fire-cast training and hard instinct alike demanded. He moved. He did not anchor himself to a single front, because a single front no longer existed. There was only collapse in managed layers. He and his cadre became a knife passed from hand to hand across the system. They leapt from district to district in battle suits blackened by ash and chemical rain, arriving where lines had begun to bow, striking hard, restoring geometry to the battlefield for a precious hour, then launching again before the rot could close over them. They shored up a breach at the western domes with descending plasma fire that turned plague mortars into fountains of molten metal and boiled meat. They slammed into an underhive interchange where cultists had overrun the transit barricades and broke the attack on disciplined bursts and missile saturation. They crossed the irradiated plain before the mining shuttle port and saved 3 regiments of auxiliaries from encirclement by collapsing a storage ridge onto the advancing pox columns and then scything through the survivors with burst cannon fire. For a time, his brilliance kept the system from instant death. Everywhere he went, the same pattern repeated. Tau doctrine seized the shape of the fight and imposed clean violence upon it. Marker lights stitched through rain and smoke. Hammerhead columns emerged from concealed trenches to gut plague engines at range, then withdrew by exact increments into prepared corridors before return fire could bracket them. Seeker missiles descended from cloud cover in blue-white shrieks that found targets invisible to lesser eyes. Drone saturation blinded enemy advances long enough for fire warriors to reposition and re-establish killing lanes. Withdrawal became ambush. Ambush became crossfire. Crossfire became annihilation. In those hours, warriors who had nearly surrendered themselves to dread found courage again beneath Kaiseren's command.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
Even human auxiliaries, half-starved, fever-haunted, and increasingly suspicious that the colony corps meant to use them as a sacrificial screen, fought like men defending the last geometry of civilization from the invasion of a nightmare. But everywhere the Tau cut the enemy down, the enemy fed upon being cut. That truth revealed itself in fresh obscenities with each passing hour. Blight haulers split open under rail impact and released swarms of drone flies thick enough to clog intake vents and blind helmet optics. Plague Marines toppled under concentrated fusion fire and lay still just long enough for a fire warrior line to advance, only to stir again as their spilled innards writhed and pulled them upright by strings of rotten tissue. Mortar crews wiped out in sheets of plasma left shell pits behind them that continued to exhale green mist long after the guns had fallen silent. Dead cultists, packed into alley mouths, swelled until their skin burst and sent spore clouds rolling into the very positions won at such cost. Kaiseren saw it, adapted to it, refused to yield to it, yet even he could not ignore that every victory was now purchased twice, once in blood, then again in sterilization, quarantine, retreat, or the abandonment of ground that had become too poisoned to hold. The first time he encountered Lord Golax Varn, it was not face to face, but across the screaming ruin of a battle net. Kaiseren had just led a strike on a plague artillery park, emplaced amid the wreckage of a collapsed mag rail causeway. The enemy position burned. Rotting artillery beasts screamed through ruptured vox throats as they died. Fire warriors moved in disciplined ranks behind his suits, executing the wounded, burning shell stockpiles, and setting code purges into captured machine nodes. For one rare moment, the battlefield had the clean lines of a completed task. Then the command channel thickened with static. A figure resolved upon the tactical overlay, towering amidst a screen of armored giants and corpse bearers. He stood in no haste, one massive gauntlet resting on the haft of a man-reaper whose blade was filmed with old slime and fresh blood alike. His armor had once been white in some forgotten and honorable age. Now it was a continent of rust, gangrenous greens, ruptured seals, hanging sensors, and plates swollen outward by corruption. Tubes ran from his gorget into flesh that no longer respected the boundaries between body and warplate. Around him, the air itself looked tired, as though it had spent centuries passing through diseased lungs. He was not frothing, not roaring, not berserk with the theatrical madness lesser cults mistook for terror. He seemed instead like a surgeon contemplating a cadaver already cut open, his interest clinical, his certainty total. When he spoke, the battle net hissed as if infected by the sound. "You close wounds, said Lord Golax Varn, and call that victory. Kaisren answered at once. You gain nothing here. The giant's ruined helm inclined the slightest fraction, as if granting an earnest pupil the courtesy of correction. Incorrect, Varn said. I gain persistence. You only ever possessed shape. The channel drowned in static. Artillery sirens renewed. New vectors lit the battlefield. The war resumed, but the words remained in Kaisren's mind with the unpleasant durability of splinters driven beneath a nail. In the command levels behind the burning fronts, Pauvre Borkan Gel made one last attempt to buy time through politics. There were moments in every crisis when men turned back toward old crafts because the alternatives had become too hideous to name. Gel could see the battlefield maps. He understood the scale of the descent. He had heard Doran Hale's blunt assessments, Tor's increasingly strained machine reports, and Kaiseren's clipped tactical briefings. Still, he reached for language, because language was the tool he possessed, and no one lays down his own last weapon simply because the enemy prefers a different kind of killing. He drafted evacuation corridor offers in human Gothic and Tau command cant, proposing controlled ceasefire windows for the removal of civilian populations from the outermost infected belts. He attached formal parleys to them, cloaking desperation in the strict dignity of interpolity process. He offered exchange of non-combatants, medical truces, broadcast channels under neutral coding. Every clause was a lie in one direction or the other, but lies had bought civilizations hours before. To the astonishment of everyone around him, the Death Guard accepted. The reply came from the same disease channels as before. A site was named, a time, a transmission protocol. Gel felt no confidence in it, but confidence was no longer the measure. Hours were. Envoys went under sealed escort to the outer exchange concourse of a cargo Nhexos already half abandoned by plague spread. Transmitters were set up. Recovery teams waited in armoured med carriers a prudent distance behind the negotiation cordon. Kroot scouts watched from the gantries. Tau snipers nested in the service shafts. It was a trap, of course. The question was only, whose? The envoys never truly met the enemy. The Death Guard sent no formal delegation. They sent a cloud. It drifted out of the dim tunnels beyond the exchange hall in glistening strands, too fine for ordinary optics to catch at first, a pale mist seeded with buzzing black motes. The transmitters picked it up before the living did. Their housings grew wet, signal dishes furred over, Vox channels filled with a low, intimate coughing that no source code could identify. By the time the envoys began to retreat, the infection had already entered their suits through the connectors and cooling seams. One of the human translators tore off his helm, convinced something was crawling inside it, and drowned on his own blood before he struck the floor. A Tau functionary stumbled back 3 paces, skin beneath his collar mottling black, and vomited a rope of glistening worms across the negotiation plinth. Recovery teams rushed forward and carried the dying away, thereby carrying the infection back with them. Gel watched the live feed until Tor cut it and ordered the entire channel bank burned out of the command system. So ended the last political play. In the industrial underhives, the war had no diplomacy at all. Doran Hale's regiments were thrown there because the underhives still mattered and because human bodies were judged fit to spend in volume, where clean Tau kill zones had collapsed into desperate close-range slaughter. The maps rendered those sectors as simple blocks beneath the main city strata. In truth, they were nations of pipework, ore elevators, waste sluices, maintenance shrines, factorum trenches, sump rivers, and habitation pits packed so tightly with life that even peace had felt like managed suffocation. Now they became graves with the dead still moving. Hale led a composite regiment through a conveyor canyon, where plague zombies came at them in such numbers that gunfire ceased to feel like combat and became mere refusal. Bodies piled, more, climbed over them. Cult mobs, driven by bells and disease-mad exaltation, poured from service chutes and hab ladders in screaming waves. When the line held, the dead simply accumulated until they became ramps over the barricades. Men disappeared beneath them, still firing, their last cries cut off under body weight. A loader servitor the size of a transport hauler, its labour routines overwritten by organic corruption, dragged itself into the fight-trailing chains, and half a worker crew still entangled in its joints. Crute auxiliaries hacked and fed and shrieked in the red gloom, while overhead pipes burst and rained warm black runoff onto everyone alike. Hale fought in it because command required it, and because there was no room left for any higher reason. At one barricade, an auxiliary lieutenant screamed over the din. "We cannot hold this weight." Hale fired point blank into the face of a bloated corpse trying to climb the man's shoulder and answered without turning. Then, "Hold the next weight. There is always a next." By the time they abandoned that line, the floor could not be seen for the layers of dead and nearly dead mashed into paste beneath boots. Fiowi Dalith Tor, meanwhile, uncovered the real shape of the campaign. He had spent long hours believing the enemy meant only to conquer, infect, and ruin. That had been insufficiently awful. In the bowels of a captured manufactorum district, fed by emergency picked returns before the final cut-off, he saw enough to understand that Nhexos Vale was being redesigned, not as a corpse, as a workshop. The seized filtration towers were not merely fouled, they were being retooled to aerosolize cultivated strains of pox. Nutrient vats in the agridomes had become breeding reservoirs for new organic slurries, whose byproducts could feed plague hosts or fuel chemshell production. Manufactoria, previously devoted to drone housings and atmospheric processors, were being converted into toxin foundries. Their assembly lines hung now with corpses, fungus sacks, and rusting cauldrons. Shrine-like structures had been erected at transit nexuses and command towers, not in worship recognizable to sane polities, but as cathedra for disease dissemination. Bells, sensors, corpse racks, and growths wired into the colony's own infrastructure so that the architecture itself participated in spread. In orbit, anchorages seized or corrupted were being prepared not as temporary lodgements, but as harbours for future fleets. Tor brought his findings to the private council chamber, and for once, even his machine-cold exactitude could not keep abhorrence from his voice. "This is not simple conquest," he said. "They are converting the colony cluster. They intend a functioning plague territory, toxin manufactoria, reservoirs for pox cultures, dissemination cathedra, forward anchorages." He looked from one commander to the next. "They mean to keep Nhexos Vale useful." Silence followed. It was Arnold Tokoshi who finally broke it, and the effort of it showed in the hollows beneath his eyes. "The wider expansion fleets?" A relay adept answered, after checking and rechecking the delayed returns, as though repetition might change the void. "Too distant. Translation estimates have worsened. Warp disturbances. Interruption of beacon lines. Even if they turn at once, honoured Arnold, their arrival may be too late for decisive relief." Koshi closed his eyes for a moment that would have looked like prayer on another species. When he opened them, serenity had not returned, only acceptance. "Then this colony has become a sacrifice point," he said. No one contradicted him. Outside, the war found a new way to become impossible. The Capitol dome had held longer than the others because it was strongest, because it was nearest the command core, because too many systems and too much prestige clung to it for anyone to abandon it easily. Its shell rose over, the inner city in a vast arc of engineered transparency, streaked now with chemical residue and lit from within by fires and failing power grids. The first breach line spiderwebbed along its northern span under sustained mortar impact and corrosive rain. Emergency drones swarmed to it, sealing, patching, reinforcing. Then the weather engines failed in sequence. Atmospheric veins misaligned. Moisture processors jammed open. Pressure controls spasmed. The dome's internal climate system, so carefully tended for years to maintain breathable balance and regulated agricultural support, turned against the population beneath it. The shell ruptured. Not wholly. Not all at once. A long tearing opened high overhead, widening as support struts buckled and fell, and through that wound the outer sky poured in. Warm rain came down, not clean rain, not the hard desert rain the colony had once welcomed in measured cycles. This was thick, fever-warm, and faintly greasy, carrying the stink of spoiled meat and chemical runoff. It pattered first across transit roofs and command terraces, then more heavily, then in sheets. Across the last uninfected population belts of the inner city, men and Tau alike looked up as the artificial weather system of Nhexos Vale vomited plague rain over them. By the time the fifth cycle of plague rain passed over the inner belts, Nhexos Vale was no longer a defended colony. It had become a territory. That truth announced itself not in one grand surrender, for there had been no surrender, but in the steady rearrangement of function. Districts did not fall with clarion defeat. They went silent. Hab spires that had once blazed with civic screens and labour canticles now stood dark, except for the jaundiced gutter of corpse fires inside their upper galleries. Command nexuses captured in the early fighting were not destroyed, but reused. Tau relay towers became belfries from which rusted clappers told slow contagion over the city. Transit hubs were profaned into congregation pits where the sick were sorted by usefulness. Air purification sanctums, all white panels and polished intake vanes in the age before, had been remade into dripping shrines of infection where sensors swung from service rails and greasy fog poured through ducts into the sectors beyond. The architecture itself had been made complicit. Angular Tau facades, built for clean purpose and efficient flow, now sagged beneath fungal veils and fly clouds. Smooth command walls had cracked under organic intrusion until the very geometry of the place seemed to rot, as if the enemy despised not merely the colony's people, but the notion that things might be rationally arranged. Every conquered structure was taught to betray its makers. Doors sealed on the healthy and open to the infected. Warning runes looped into devotional blasphemies. Nutrient channels became sluices for black runoff thick with eggs and worms. Even the drone docks, those cathedra of precision and maintenance, had been turned into hatching racks for winged pests and the dismembered remains of corrupted machine forms. Survivors were not simply butchered. That would have been cleaner. The Death Guard's cruelty lay in method. They penned the living by caste. Earth-caste engineers were dragged one way, bound and muzzled, their hands examined, their lungs sounded, their blood drawn into rusted syringes by attendants whose own flesh sloughed off their bones as they worked. Fire-caste wounded were sorted apart from labourers, not for mercy, but because their altered metabolisms interested the invaders. Human auxiliaries were divided according to prior service. useful hatred, and the degree to which fever had already entered their blood. Kroot captives were caged behind shock fields and watched by plague adepts with clinical fascination, their flesh judged as though it were a particularly stubborn material, requiring more inventive tools. Nothing was wasted, nothing was hurried. Infection came in waves, measured and staged. A district would be broken by hunger first, then by contamination, then by the deliberate arrival of terms. Those who crawled out begging for relief were marked, clustered, and assigned their new uses. Some became labor, some became fodder, some became experiments. Some were simply left alive long enough to understand the sequence. Pauvre Borkan Gel saw the process with his own eyes in the remains of the Southern Civic Exchange, and whatever faith still lived in him as a diplomat died there without dignity. He had crossed 3 dead sectors beneath stolen filtration gear and a cloak blackened with sewage to reach the exchange, following rumors that the occupiers were receiving petitioners under banners of truce. Such things offended every sane principle of warfare, which was precisely why Gel needed to see them. Somewhere within him, even after the poisoned parleys and the mass betrayals, there remained a thin and shameful hope that occupation must at some point require administration. That administration might need negotiators. That utility might still purchase survival. He arrived in time to witness the answer. They came from the outer worker belts in knots of desperation. Human colonists, Guevesa overseers, Tau labor castes too exhausted to stand upright. A few limping fire warriors with broken rifles mag-clamped to their backs and bandages already gone green beneath the wrappings. They approached the exchange plaza with hands empty and voices hoarse, calling for terms in Gothic, in Tau command cant, in whatever cracked language fear made available to them. The enemy received them, not with gunfire, not at first. The crowd was allowed to kneel before a ring of plague marines, standing in immobile watchfulness around the plaza's central water feature. Now a basin of clotted slime in which pale things pulsed and surfaced. A herald in rotting robes read out decrees from a corroded data scroll. Promise of labor, promise of rations, promise of continued function beneath a new and truer order of endurance. The begging became gratitude. Men bowed their heads. Tau workers submitted their wrists for inspection. An old human began to sob in relief. Then the sorting commenced. Those judged still strong enough to carry weight were branded with corrosive runes and driven toward the manufacturum roads under escort of club-bearing cultists. Those already fevered were injected where they knelt and left to writhe together until their convulsions synchronized into something almost liturgical. Those too broken for labor were not killed. They were led to the basin, where plague attendants pushed their faces beneath the slime one by one until they emerged coughing black water and strings of parasite spawn. Within the hour, they shambled back out as plague labor, eyes filmed, mouths open, hands still remembering how to lift crates and turn wheels even after thought had fled. Gel watched all of it from the shadow of a broken intake tower. When one of the kneeling Tau workers raised his eyes and croaked an appeal in the language of civic function, asking only for a ration allotment and a place among the useful, the answer came in the form of a rusted prod through the throat. The body was kicked into the basin. It rose later and joined the labor line. Something in Gel gave way then, not loudly, no heroic break, simply the final collapse of the old lie that every system, however monstrous, contained a vocabulary for accommodation. He backed away from the plaza and did not stop until he had vomited into the shell of an overturned sanitation unit. In another quarter of the conquered city, Sepsid Morb began his proofs. The biologus putrefier had made himself at home in the remains of an earth-cast fabrication wing beneath the eastern agrispine. He liked the place because its machines had been built for purity. He enjoyed purity most when violating it. What had once been a bright hall of assembly lines, sterilized benches, drone cradles, and nutrient-safe manifolds now sweated with condensation and organic rot. Lamps were hooded in translucent membranes grown from vat cultures. Surgical rigs had been fused to industrial drill arms and ore injectors. Tanks intended for algal propagation held things that should never have known liquid, and yet swam there with ghastly purpose. Sepsid Morb moved through his laboratories with the pensive absorption of an artisan. His armor was caked with old filth and fresh reagents alike. Tubes fed from bulbous chem reservoirs on his back into gauntlets fitted with injectors, flensing saws, and dispensing needles thick as awls. His voice, when he addressed his assistants, had the patient amusement of a lecturer, guiding dull pupils toward revelation. "Observe the little optimists," he murmured, peering down at a bound earth-cast technician whose blue-grey skin had mottled where experimental spores had taken root under. The dermis. Clean lines, measured humours, miserly souls. They thought themselves exempt because they lacked the delicious warp fat of mankind. He clicked his tongue behind the respirator grill. Yet all flesh is an argument. We shall teach them generosity. The technician tried to speak. A rebreather tube in his mouth turned the effort into wet choking. Nearby, Firecast wounded were strapped upright in exo-restraints so their altered physiology could be studied under stress. Morb had found their resilience intriguing. Pulse burns sealed differently in them. Their clotting responses were efficient. Their immune cascades fought with admirable stubbornness against the first waves of introduced contagion. So he abandoned simple infection and moved to industry. Weaponized nutrient rot was pumped through their veins. Parasite cultures harvested from burst agrivats were implanted in abdominal cavities, opened by mechanic saws, and held apart with clamps made from drone, articulation limbs. Earthcast Medicae software, corrupted and repurposed, monitored the results with immaculate thoroughness. "Fascinating," Morb said, as one Tau prisoner convulsed hard enough to snap 2 restraint studs before sagging back, his skin now growing translucent blisters full of yellow broth. "Even the soulless can bloom. Grandfather is not unkind. He merely requires surrender from every category." One of his assistants, a plague surgeon with one arm replaced by a dripping auger, asked, "Shall these be retained?" "For now. Their reactions differ by caste. I would like more comparisons. Bring me one of the thin diplomats next, and the winged cannibal mercenaries if any still breathe." Thus did Nhexos Vale serve its occupiers not only as territory, but as lesson. Shasil Sasea Kaisaren moved through this new order like a hunted blade. He no longer commanded a coherent front. He commanded absences, a squad hidden in a drowned transit tunnel. A battlesuit with one failing thruster concealed in the shell of a collapsed ore elevator. 3 fire warrior teams and a knot of drones clinging to a maintenance shaft network beneath the capital belt. He gathered what remained by stealth, precision, and the reputation of his own endurance. The dead transit arteries of the city became his roads. He travelled them through darkness, thick with mould and corpse stink, through shafts where the walls sweated warm black moisture, through maintenance crawls half blocked by the bodies of those who had tried to flee and failed. Everywhere he went, there were signs that the war had passed from battle into possession. Bells above, chanting in human throats gone ruinous with devotion and fever, the scrape of plague labor columns hauling stolen ammunition and salvaged machine parts toward the new sanctums, the intermittent thunder of executions, and the more intimate sounds that followed capture. He did not linger over those sounds. His purpose had narrowed to an edge. Gather the intact. Assess what still mattered. Strike once where it could wound the occupying structure rather than merely its appetite. Any counterstroke now would be impossible by conventional measure, which made it the only kind worth attempting. When he found Doran Hale, it was in the shell of a municipal substation beneath the southern underhives. The place stank of burned insulation, recaf grounds, sewage, and men who had slept in armor too long. Hale sat on an ammunition crate with a blood-caked bandage around his neck and a human shotgun across his knees. Around him clustered what remained of a composite force no cleaner than the war itself. Gavesa veterans, hollow-eyed fire warriors, maintenance workers with cutting torches, drones patched with scrap plating and wired into obedience by hand. Hale looked up as Kaisaren entered and gave a laugh that held no humour. So the dead still walk on both sides. You have survivors, Kaisaren said. I have the sort of survivors you do not want in a parade. Hale rose with a wince. We held the human belts longer after the orders stopped coming. Kaisaren said nothing. Hale met his gaze. Do you know why? The Shazal's silence was answer enough. Hatred, Hale said. Once they understood they had been abandoned, they stopped hoping for relief and started fighting to spit in the enemy's eye before they died. Some fought for the Empire out of habit, some for their kin, most for spite. He spat onto the deck. Spite kept them standing longer than doctrine. A fire warrior nearby bristled at the insolence, but Kaisaren raised one hand and the protest died unborn. Can you still fight? The Shazal asked. Hale bared his teeth. That is all we have left. Above them, in the ruined civic sanctum at the heart of the capital belt, Aunol Taukoshi learned what remained of command when obedience had been flensed away by plague and betrayal. He had retreated there with a remnant honor guard, functionaries, and those citizens of rank who had still managed to reach the inner sanctum before the outer seals failed. The chamber had once been a place from which calm law descended upon the colony. Now its upper galleries dripped with rainwater and rot. One wall had collapsed inward beneath mortar impact, opening the sanctum to a view of the ruined city beyond. Through that wound came the tolling of plague bells and the stink of the occupied streets. The men around Koshi were exhausted, infected, or both. Some still wore the livery of the civil caste. Some clutched rifles they scarcely knew how to use. A few fire warriors stood in hard silence, their discipline the only upright thing left in the chamber. When the outer doors began to buckle under repeated impacts and the voices beyond grew louder, Koshi stepped forward as if to address an assembly. You will hold, he said. You will remember your function. You will... A human auxiliary with blood dried over half his face rounded on him then, and whatever reverence might once have stilled such a thing had long since bled out into the floors of the city. Function, the man rasped. My sons drowned in your quarantine tunnels. The ethereal drew himself up, offended less by the accusation than by the failure of tone. You speak to... The doors burst inward. It was not a noble death, not a final speech crystallized into martyrdom. Plague laborers surged in first, driven by cult overseers with hooked poles. Behind them came the heavier tread of armored giants. The chamber filled at once with gunfire, screams, and the wet percussion of bodies breaking in close quarters. Koshi tried to command order over the din. He tried to call men back to discipline, to shape chaos with authority alone. No one could hear him. Or if they did, the war had already taught them the weight of his voice. A plague-ridden worker, once a sanitation labourer by the look of his ruined harness, struck him down with a length of snapped rail while trying to reach one of the honour guards behind him. Koshi fell against the dais from which he had so often promised purpose. Feet trampled him as the press surged over the platform. By the time one of the fire warriors cut his way back to the body, the ethereal's skull had been split under the crush, and his blood was running down the carved symbol of the greater good. Thus died the master of civic harmony, not beneath the claws of a glorious monster, but beneath the war he had believed rhetoric could master. Lord Golax Varn claimed the central command spire before the next cycle of false dawn. He did not storm it in visible exultation. He ascended it as one enters a field already planted. His retinue moved through the upper levels with rusted standards and sensors, executing or collecting the survivors according to some interior calculus only they understood. When Varn reached the highest command balcony and looked out across the colony cluster, there was no triumphant roar, no boast, no moment of theatrical dominion. He studied the spreading ruin as a cultivator studies acreage. "Raise the standards," he said. So plague banners went up above every dome still standing, every relay mast still transmitting, every dock that could receive a ship, every command tower left upright by the bombardments. Green and rust and corpse white snapped in the wet wind over the architecture of a conquered empire. To those watching from hiding places below, it looked like desecration. To Varn, it was agriculture. Kaiseren learned the full meaning of that occupation only hours later, when one of Tor's surviving machine adepts limped into the Underhive refuge, carrying a purged data core wrapped in 3 layers of sterilized cloth. The adept was missing most of his left arm. Something had eaten the rest. He knelt before Kaiseren, hands shaking. Intercepted from the upper relay net before the final corruption spread. Partial only. Enough. Tor himself appeared moments later by holofeed, his image flickering through static and spore distortion from whatever hidden machine cell still sheltered him. "They are preparing system-wide beacon broadcasts," the engineer said without preamble. His face was grey with fatigue. "Nhexos Vale is being declared safe harbour." Hale frowned. Safe harbour for what? Tor's expression did not change. Plague fleets, corrupted transports, contagion anchorages. The broadcast codes invite ingress, resupply, and staging. They are listing orbital conditions, surface conversion capacity, manufactorum output projections, contamination levels, dock viability, and expansion vectors into neighbouring frontier lanes. Kaiseren took the wrapped core in both hands, as if weight might make the truth less abstract. "This was not a raid," Hale said softly. "No," Tor replied. "Or rather, it was. Only not in the sense we hoped. This was the opening seizure. They meant from the first to turn the colony into a mouth." Silence settled over the refuge. Not shocked silence, the kind that comes when dread at last finds its exact name. Above them, through layers of rusted deck and corpse-clogged service shafts, the bells of occupied Nhexos Vale tolled on, and from the captured relays, the first diseased beacon songs began to spread into the dark between the stars. Only when the truth had become too large to deny did Chassel Sasea Kaiseren finally understand the word. Raid. Among the Tau, a raid was a knife thrust of purpose, swift incursion, limited objective, exact violence. You struck, you took, you withdrew. A frontier commander understood the term in that hard, useful shape. but the invaders had come from an older grammar, from a culture that had spent 10,000 years teaching language to crawl on its belly through mud and blood and plague water. For the Death Guard, a raid was not theft and departure. It was a seizure made quickly enough that the wound never closed. It was the taking of a frontier system by rot, then the holding of it until the scar itself became a mouth for further infection. Nhexos Vale had not been assaulted. It had been planted. The realization sat in Kaisren's mind like a shard of frozen metal as he stood in the dim machine chapel where the last council gathered. The place had once served as a maintenance command annex under the eastern transit route. Now the walls wept condensation and black streaks of algae from cracked purge pipes. Half the lumen strips were dead. The surviving ones burned with a pallid, clinical glare over faces that had long ceased to resemble command. Fiowi Dalith Tor stood bent over a hololithic projection built from scavenged emitters and power stolen from a dormant thermal sink. Pauvre Borkan Gel leaned against a rusted relay column with a pistol at his hip and a dead expression in his eyes. Doran Hale sat upon an overturned munitions crate while med-drone needles stitched his side closed without anesthetic. Around them, the remnants of cadres, auxiliaries, workers, and machine adepts waited in a silence so taut it no longer felt like fear. It felt like the shape of the final order before it is spoken. Kaisran looked at the planet map suspended between them. Infection bloom, occupied domes, captured relays, Manufactoria converted, thermal infrastructure still partially under colony control, Beacon Cathedral active at the core of the seized command district. "We have one remaining advantage," he said. No one interrupted. "They believe the system taken. They are correct. They believe the colony usable. They are correct. They believe we cannot deny them stable function without also killing what remains of our own people." His gaze moved from face to face. "They are also correct." Hale gave a low, humorless breath. "So, that is the advantage?" "Yes." Tor keyed the projection. The atmosphere processors lit in hard blue. Beneath them, the deeper thermal cores of the colony's engineered weather systems glowed amber red like coals. "3 actions," Kaiseren said. "The beacon complex must be destroyed before its plague summons fully routes through the frontier lanes. The atmosphere processors must be overloaded and their poisoned stock driven into ignition. The thermal cores must be forced into catastrophic venting. We deny stable harbor. We deny production. We deny atmosphere. We deny ground." "And every living thing still on world?" Gel asked. Kaiseren did not soften the answer. "We deny that also." The water-cast diplomat lowered his head once. It was not submission. It was acceptance, stripped of ornament. Tor expanded the processor networks into branching chains of light. The scrubber towers are already fouled beyond recovery. Their chambers are saturated with volatile biological compounds, chem residues, and flammable atmospheric contaminants. If I force the intake cycles to reverse, then spike the thermal regulators beneath the upper processor spines, I can turn the sky itself into fuel. His voice remained steady because engineering was the only honesty left to him. "The continental firestorms will sterilize broad sectors, or rather, they will fail to sterilize them completely, but they will destroy function on a scale sufficient to collapse habitability and industrial continuity." Hale looked up from the med drone. "Speak low Gothic, engineer." Tor turned his head. "I can set the world on fire." "Good," Hale said. The Earthcast engineer inclined his head the slightest amount, then returned to the projection. "The thermal cores must be rigged by hand. The automated systems are too corrupted. I will need access teams in the lower processor vaults and scrubber towers. You will. Ye have them, Kaiseren said. Gel pushed himself off the relay column. And the message? Kaiseren looked to him. The diplomat's mouth twitched, though not in anything as generous as a smile. You will want warning transmitted across surviving TOW frequencies before the beacons die. Not hope, not reassurance, not one more lie of orderly recovery. Truth. His fingers closed around the edge of the relay console beside him until the knuckles whitened. I will send it. You are not required to. I know what I am required to do, Gel said, and there was a new thing in his voice, not refinement, not measured control, but a bright and dangerous hatred given discipline. I negotiated districts into sacrifice. I translated necessity into obedience. I fed frightened citizens the vocabulary by which they walked into quarantine and stayed there. Let me at least name the carrion field for those who may yet avoid it. Kaiseren studied him for a moment, then bowed his head once. Do so. Hale rose from the crate with a grunt, checked the load in his shotgun, then looked at the Manufacturum Valley marked on the projection. That is where you need the road held, he said. The valley cut between the broken agri-belts and the Central Command District. A trench of industrial ruins now thick with plague labor columns, demon engines, and dug-in Death Guard gun lines. It was the only route by which Kaiseren's strike force could reach the Beacon Cathedral before the final transmissions propagated beyond disruption. We do not hold it, Kaiseren said. We wound through it. Hale's face, lined with exhaustion and old anger, hardened into something almost peaceful. That will cost tens of thousands. Yes. Then it had better cost them more. So the plan was laid. Not to win, to deny, not to save, to scar. The last act of Nhexos Vale would not be defense, but refusal. They moved before the next, Plague Dawn. Fioi Tor descended with his engineer cells into the buried arteries of the colony weather system. They carried purge lances, heat locks, code chisels, and satchel charges packed with thermal catalyst. They moved through processor vaults, where the walls sweated yellow vapor, and the intake turbines were furred with fungus thick as moss on a corpse. In places, they had to cut their way through doors fused shut by organic matter. In others, they passed silent heaps of workers chained to control banks and left there until the air had melted their lungs. Tor catalogued nothing. He was beyond revulsion now. Every act had become mechanical purpose. He opened thermal housings with his own hands. He severed safeties. He rammed override spikes into machine shrines that had once answered only to calibrated logic and now muttered corrupted maintenance cant through speaker grills clogged with meat. This, he said once to no one at all as he forced a regulator past Redline, is the last form of engineering left to us. Above him, the towers began to hum. Porvra Gel climbed to the highest surviving relay chamber, still outside direct plague occupation. 2 fire warriors accompanied him. Neither spoke. The chamber's walls were blackened by prior transmission burns, and the central console stank of ozone and mildew. The remaining network was weak, fragmented, but still sufficient for a final burst if the machine adepts' improvised patches held. Gel stood before the console and looked through the broken viewport toward the city that had once answered to his words. The domes were ruined humps beneath a yellow sky. Plague standards snapped above relay towers and dock ribs. Bells tolled from the occupied core. Far beyond, the Manufactorum Valley already burned with muzzle flashes as Hale's regiments advanced into the choke. A relay adept asked, "Porvre, the message text?" Gel shook his head. "No text. Live." The adept hesitated only a moment, then opened the channels. Across surviving tow frequencies, command bands, emergency lines, drone maintenance loops, auxiliary vox nets, and frontier picket echoes still lingering at the edge of range, Gel's voice went out over the dying empire of Nhexos Vale. This is Pauvre Borkan Gel of the Nhexos Colonial Command. Hear and record. There will be no victory transmission after this. There will be no relief declaration. Nhexos Vale is lost. He paused as static scraped through the lines. Mark this well. The enemy did not raid us in the manner we taught ourselves to expect. They did not strike and depart. They seized, routed, and converted. The frontier can be made into bait. It can be turned into carrion. A colony may become a harbour for plague before the wider empire can even answer its distress. Let every edgeworld hear this and harden. Trust no unexplained silence. Burn contamination before census. Break relay contact before it spreads. If you cannot save a holding, deny it. If you cannot hold a world, wound it so deeply that even victory sickens the conqueror. His voice thinned, then strengthened again with pure fury. We were too proud of order, too certain that function would preserve us. Learn from our dead. The frontier is not a threshold. It is a mouth. Do not feed yourselves to it as we did. The message went out until the channels began to die one by one. Gel continued speaking long after he knew the surviving audience had dwindled to fragments, because there was grace in truth at last, and he had sold too much grace for lies already. In the Manufacturum Valley, Doran Hale led the charge that bought those minutes with blood. The valley had once been a corridor of production, forge lines, storage cathedra, processing towers, trackways for ore crawlers and drone convoys. Now it was a pestilent ravine of broken gantries, plague trenches, shell craters full of bubbling runoff, and rusted industrial giants, mounted with new guns. Poxwalkers packed the lower approach in such density that the ground seemed to move. Demon engines crouched between Manufactorum shells like diseased artillery beasts, their mouths venting chem haze over gun lines of plague marines dug in behind walls of scrap and corpses. Hale's composite assault had no elegance left in it. Guevesa regiments in scavenged masks, fire warriors stripped to reduced kit for speed, maintenance crews bearing purge torches and demolition satchels, Kroot mercenaries lean with hunger and black humour, drones patched from wreckage and wired to obey one final sequence before self-immolation. Hale climbed the wreck of a loader platform and raised his shotgun. "Forward," he voxed. "Forward until you drown them or they drown you. No one behind us needs courage bought cheap." Then the valley took them. Pulsefire cut blue lanes through the green murk. Human autoguns hammered in ragged reply. Kroot slipped ahead through wreckage and came back dragging screaming cultists out of slit trenches by the throat. The first demon engine died under a seeker strike so precise it lifted the thing half clear of the ground before its belly split and sprayed burning slime across both armies. Men vanished in that spray and kept running while on fire because there was nowhere left to retreat that was not already death. The poxwalkers met the charge like floodwater meets masonry. They climbed over one another, over the burning, over the exploded, over the bodies of their own dead still kicking. Hale emptied both barrels into the face of one that had once worn a Tau labour rig, broke its skull apart, then rammed the hot barrels under the jaw of another and fired upward until the back of its head came off in a wet fan of teeth and pus. He reloaded by reflex and kept shouting for the line to dress, 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 because even now, even in this hell, shape mattered for another heartbeat. It cost tens of thousands. Whole files of auxiliaries disappeared beneath bodyweight, where they were overrun in the chem fog. Fire warrior teams were bracketed by plague marine bolter fire that turned armor into flying ceramic shards and meat. Drones descended in swarms to blind heavy guns and detonated amid the embrasures, buying seconds in blossoms of white fire. Kroot kindreds reached the first trench line and turned it into an abattoir of hooked blades and wet tearing. Behind them came workers with charges who flung themselves into bunker mouths and died grinning through blood as the explosives went up. Hale saw none of it as sacrifice in the grand sense, only transaction, minutes purchased with flesh. He kept the assault moving because stillness meant the end of Kaiseren's road to the cathedral. At the valley's midpoint, with the dead already layered knee-deep in places, Hale looked up through the drifting filth and saw crisis suits streaking above the gun lines toward the occupied core. "Go!" he whispered, though they could not hear him. Kaiseren and his remaining cadres reached the beacon cathedral beneath Stormlight and Bell Thunder. The structure had once been the central communications spire of Nhexos Vale, a masterpiece of tow clarity rising from the command district in ascending tiers of relay vanes, signal dishes, and polished hard white surfaces. The Death Guard had remade it into something obscene. Rusted bells hung from the once clean flying buttresses of support towers. Corpses swung from signal spars by chains through their jaws. Sensors big as grav transports vomited curtains of mucus vapor into the air. The lower halls had been opened and combined into a single vast nave around the beacon machinery itself, so that cathedral-scale transmitter organs rose amid altars crusted with slime and offerings of flesh. Signal pylons pulsed through growths that looked half fungal and half vascular. The entire place breathed in great, slow convulsions, as if the machinery had developed lungs. Kaiseren entered through a breach carved by fusion fire and drone detonation. The few suits still at his side fanned out, cutting down plague attendants and corrupted relay servitors before they could bring the lower guns to bear. Above them, bells boomed. Vox ghosts wailed through the beacon stacks. The whole cathedral smelled of rust, incense, old blood, and something else, something warm and digestive, as though the air itself were being consumed and exhaled transformed. At the far end of the nave, amid hanging chains and swinging censers, Lord Golax Varn waited. He stood before the central beacon altar, with his man-reaper grounded beside him, as immovable as a statue carved from the memory of decay. Around him clustered a ring of Terminator-armored bodyguards and plague priests chanting over the transmitter routes. Varn raised one gauntlet. The bodyguards stepped back. He did not look amused. He looked unsurprised. "You have come to bruise the harvest," he said. Kaiseren advanced with weapons hot. "I have come to deny it." Varn lifted the man-reaper. "There is no difference." Then they met. In physical truth, the duel was unequal in opposite directions. Kaiseren was speed, economy, precision, born of relentless discipline. His suit's thrusters snapped him sideways in clean bursts. Plasma fire stitched exact wounds across Varn's armor. The tow commander fought with the clarity of a species that builds war as geometry and movement. Every strike sought a seam. Every feint existed to draw mass into error. He was cleaner, faster, better in all the ways sane military theory would honor. Varn was all the things sane theory fails to account for. He moved with the ponderous certainty of a siege tower rolling downhill. Slower, yes. Heavier, yes. Every blow of the man-reaper carved great diseased arcs through air already thick with poison. He absorbed hits that should have ended any battlefield life worth naming. Kaiseren's plasma cored one shoulder plate and blew away a slab of rotten flesh the size of a shield. Varn kept advancing. A burst from the suit's fusion blaster struck center mass and left a glowing cavity through which blackened organs could briefly be seen writhing. Varn kept advancing. Kaiseren's severed tubes, shattered knee plating, drove a combat blade through the gap beneath the gorget and tore sideways. Varn's blood, if blood it could still be called, came out in a steaming sludge full of white larvae. Still, he came. The bells above them shook with each impact of his tread. Kaiseren launched high on thrust and came down behind the giant, firing into the back seam of the armor, where power cores and spine should have made a clean vulnerability. The shot tore open the plate in a spray of corrosion and flame. Varn half turned, as if pained by an old memory rather than the present wound, and backhanded the suit with such force that warning runes flooded. Kaiseren's vision and half the nave spun sideways in a blur of chains and hanging dead. He landed hard, rolled, came up on one knee, and fired again. Varn kept advancing. "That is your species' flaw," the Death Guard Lord said, voice rolling through cracked helm speakers like tomb doors grinding open. "You confuse damage with defeat." Kaiseren said nothing. Breath and pain had no place in command. He triggered the beacon charges by remote instead. Deep within the cathedral, demolition runes blinked from green to white. At the same moment, miles below and across the poisoned continents, Tor's overrides reached ignition threshold. The thermal cores screamed awake in revolt. The atmosphere processors reversed. Scrubber towers overfed on chem saturation and volatile spore compounds until the very clouds above Nhexos Vale became a waiting pyre. Gel's final transmission died in a burst of static so violent it turned the relay chamber into an oven of blue sparks. He laughed once as the consoles caught fire around him. In the valley, Hale's last line broke only after the plague gun lines began exploding behind the enemy, their ammunition cooking off in chain reaction as the overloading air itself turned treacherous. In the Beacon Cathedral, Kaiseren drove forward through the moment of distraction, with every reserve of power his suit still held. He cut low, severing Varn's already wounded knee assembly, then rose with thrusters screaming and buried his fusion blade into the beacon altar itself. Energy surged. The transmitter routes convulsed. Mucus altars burst apart in sprays of incandescent filth. Bells overhead cracked and split under the shockwave. Varn swung the Man Reaper in a killing arc that carved through the suit's left side. Armor panels flew. Warning systems died in clusters. Kaiseren felt hot pain lace through him where shrapnel entered flesh. He tore the blade free and drove his damaged suit bodily into the central beacon, stack. The cathedral died in light. The explosion did not redeem Nhexos Vale. Redemption had long since passed beyond function, but it destroyed the beacon network. It broke the cathedral. It turned the upper command district into a tower of collapsing signal spires and tumbling rusted bells. Across the colony cluster, relays burst, plague summons guttered, and vast sectors ignited as the reversed atmosphere processors finally fed fire to the poisoned sky. Continent-scale firestorms rolled over the agri wastes and manufacturing belts. The domes burned from within. Towers became candles. Entire districts vanished beneath moving walls of orange-white flame chased by black smoke thousands of meters high. Seas of contamination boiled in their basins. Trench lines became furnaces. Vast portions of Nhexos Vale burned. Not enough. The Death Guard had spread too deep, into the soil, into the ducts, into the oceans beneath the reservoirs, into the dead stacked in towers and pits and transit tunnels, into the living who still fled through the fire with lungs already carrying the seed of future bloom, into the architecture, into the machine routes, into the memory of the place. The system was denied salvation. It was not denied corruption. When Kaiserin clawed his way from the cathedral ruin, half blinded and dragging one ruined leg of his suit behind him, he saw the capital burning beneath a sky split between firestorm glow and the sick green of deeper weather yet unspent. Of Vale, there was no body, only a broken section of rusted armor half buried beneath fallen beacon stone, and a smear of black sludge vanishing into the melt. Perhaps the Lord had died, perhaps he had not. The distinction no longer mattered. The world itself had taken up his purpose. Kaiserin staggered to the edge of the shattered district and looked once upon what remained of Nhexos Vale. Bells still tolled from sectors untouched by the fires. In the distance, through smoke and rising, thermal storms, plague standards, yet moved. Even now, even after this. He understood then that denial was all they had achieved. A wound given to the conqueror, yes, a deep one, but only a wound. Months later, when the storms had thinned and the wider empire at last sent picket forces back toward the frontier coordinates of lost Nhexos Vale, they came in caution and silence. The first ships expected a dead zone, a cinder system, a void full of drifting wreckage and ash-choked weather returns. They found instead lights, not the ordered blue of tow beacon chains. Plague lights, sick green lantern glows burned in orbit where fresh anchorages clung to the salvaged bones of the old docks. Corrupted vessels moved slow patrol arcs above the world, their hulls diseased and barnacled and unmistakably at home. On the surface, the main colony cluster lay scarred black and red beneath perpetual bruise clouds, vast sectors still smouldering, others already repurposed into new geometries of rot. The ruined domes had become pestilent bastions. Relay spires, regrown with grotesque additions, pulsed corruption into the dark. The beacons, though broken in their first great heart, had been replaced by lesser throats enough to sing. What was once a frontier colony was now Death Guard territory, a rotting fortress at the bright edge of empire. And from its diseased harbours, its plague cathedra, its reclaimed docks and poisoned skies, Nhexos Vale broadcast sickness into the stars.